Well, this video is the first of three parts that will deal with the Council of Nicaea, and then we will have a three-part series that will deal with the Council of Chalcedon. And as we begin, it's important to kind of grasp where we've been. And where have we been? Let me see if what I can bring up to kind of get you an idea of just where we've been. Let's see if I can find what I want to find. Well, that ain't it. So you did the Apostolic Fathers, and let's see if I can figure out a way to jump into that so that I can make sure you've got your bearings. Where we've been is through the New Testament. We have been to the early part of the church, and we've seen all the way up until the Apostolic Fathers just how the church begins. It's a kind of a rocky beginning, and we have to talk about a couple of things. And part of what we have to talk about is the notion of canon. How do we get the Bible we have? We also have to talk about what happens after the Apostolic Fathers. But I want to begin with a look at the Apostolic Fathers, and of course it's all the way down here. Here it is. So there were definitely some different leaders and issues. You can look at, and you were supposed to look at all of this information and try to kind of correlate it. I want to point out the important figures once more, just so that you have an idea. I want you to be able to go back and get them and be able to tell me a little something about Ignatius of Antioch. He was one who taught the deity of Christ. He obviously did all of these things. Look at this PowerPoint presentation. He describes the use of he uses the term Catholicos, which is the Church Universal. But we talked about Ignatius. He writes the letters to the churches on his way to martyrdom. Then we looked at Clement. Clement is, I think, one of the more important of the Apostolic Fathers, if not the most. If I had a hunch, the hunch would be that when when Luke finishes Acts, that it is Clement that he aims to transition to. Clement of Rome, who writes a 44-chapter book to the city of Corinth, and full of admonitions. And you can look, obviously, what Clement stands for. This was all supposed to be done for last week. Polycarp doesn't mean many fish, right? But instead, he is a martyr of the church. He writes a little letter, supposed to be a disciple of John, the Apostle John, which makes Polycarp about 7 years old when he comes to faith, which is something else. Did a lot of work in the text, and writes one letter, at least to the church of the Ephesians, I think it is. And then he has the little book called The Martyrdom of Polycarp, which somebody else has written about him, of course. And that's what we know of Polycarp. Papias is an early compiler of the canon. And we're going to talk about canon in just a moment. He's the one who starts to talk about who wrote the Gospels. He's got Matthew and he's got Mark as one of the early sources. The Didache, that literally means the teaching. And the teaching this is probably a very early text. Doesn't have an author name, so it doesn't get included in the canon. So it doesn't get included because it doesn't have an author name to it, but it was very old and very well-known piece. And there are actual pieces of it you can kind of run into. There are 4 parts of it. Now, I want to take a minute to look at this little grid, because when we deal with Nicaea and Chalcedon, we're starting to move through the period of the heresies. And so here's a little chart of heresy. Now, heresy, to be a heresy, has to be 90% true. Otherwise, what's the point of believing it? There's no such thing as fake news. If it looks so fake, everybody can tell. But if there's enough truth in it to make people think twice, that's when it leads people astray. So look at the chart. The Judaizers, a first century group, and the main point of their error has to do with soteriology. That is adding stuff in addition to grace. So the grace of Christ encounters a person, but we're going to add these works of mercy and these works of the law in order to maintain one's salvation. Probably Pharisees and Jews that comprised this group, probably legalistic, although it's really hard. We're painting with a roller, not a brush here. And deals with Old Testament Judaism and the interaction between the two groups, Jews and Gentiles. So the Judaizers were some who thought that since Gentiles could come into the church, they would become good Jews because of what Jesus has done, and therefore they would have to follow the law, they would have to be circumcised, and they would have to be good Jews too. There are some modern day, or some modern is hardly the term when you look at it, but there are people who ascribe to a sort of Judaizing tendency, but not so much anymore. Although the Seventh-day Adventists can sometimes be characterized as such, the Seventh-day Adventists that I know are not that kind of group at all. The Gnostics is a second heresy. And it's a crystallized, by the way, every heresy, if you want Rob's version of what makes a heresy, it's this. It has to do with the nature of Jesus. So in the Judaizers' first heresy, it is Jesus isn't enough, that the cross wasn't enough. You need the law. The Gnostics, and people are questioning whether this is a productive term now because no one has been able to point to a solid corollary for this, but the Gnosticism, a Christological heresy, denying the reality of the incarnation. Now, Gnosticism is basically saying that Jesus couldn't have been God in the flesh. What God, after all, would deign to put on flesh? Jesus probably was a real human, but that is part of what makes him glorious. He is able to dispense with his physical flesh in order to be elevated to God. The Gnostics said that this way of elevation was a way by knowledge. So you refined your knowledge and thus ascended a ladder to heaven. You had a lot of different people who can probably be lumped into this category. The one that comes to mind is Valentinus, where we get Valentine's Day from. But like I said, more and more, it's unresolved whether these things are actually, these things can actually be descriptive of categories that you can, in other words, Gnosticism is such a broad category. You could throw all kinds of people into that bucket. It's probably need more precision about that specific thing. It's a mystical blend of some paganism, and you say paganism, but it's really philosophy and spirituality, and they blend it with Christian ideas so that Jesus is the absolutely quintessential Gnostic who rises through the material into the spiritual and gives up his own life on the cross. Now, that does not mean that Jesus was divine. It means that Jesus was physically was a human person, but his human person was such that he, was able to ascend the ladder, so to speak. There are some New Age religions, true, that do this. The Arians, right here, this box, this is who we're going to talk about. Arians are with Chalcedon and Nicaea. The Pelagians, this is where we have Augustine, And the Socinians, we probably won't even describe them. They're all the way in the 16th century. We probably won't get to the Socinians. That's not my cup of tea or my expertise. But the Arians in the 4th century, another Christological heresy, they deny the deity of Christ. So if the Gnostics deny that Jesus was fully God, so did the Arians, but they deny it a little bit differently. So what they say is that Jesus had a birthday, and if Jesus had a birthday, well, then we've got issues. And so there are several bishops, and there are some Unitarians. They deny the full deity of Jesus, and so they say you can't have a Trinity either, because how can you have these three differentiations within God? Isn't that, and their rallying cry, was there a time when God was not? So we'll get to that in just a moment. And then contemporary manifestation of Arian heresy would be the Jehovah's Witness, who deny the Trinity and also the deity of Christ. The Pelagians, surfacing in the 5th century, is who Augustine tangles with. And their claim is that now that you've been discovered by grace, this is kind of like a Christian version of Judaizing, where the person has to be equipped for grace and be able to sustain it on one's own, denying the idea that divine grace is sufficient. Divine grace gets you to a place where then you have to pick up the ball and move it. Pelagius, of course, is and Calestius. These are two proponents of Pelagianism. So anthropocentric, it denies human fallenness. So there's a free will here, but in terms of Pelagianism, there's the idea that it's within humanity, the potential to move is within humanity. So grace gets you so far, but Pelagianism is one that says human activity and cooperation. Now I have to be honest with you. There's a lot of attractive features about Pelagianism. We only have Pelagian thought because Augustine deals with it and negates it. And so that becomes a bit problematic. So the following slides depict some of these heresies in a little more detail, like Gnosticism. Here are the different regions that knowledge is supposed to help get you through. Marcion he's an interesting heretic in the middle of the 2nd century. This is one who will do battle with the person like Polycarp. Dualistic belief system, created his own Bible and tossed out a bunch of scripture. Marcion is really the one who gets us started talking about the canon, and I'll talk about the canon in a moment or two. Let's see here. That's that. Okay. So that is Marcion, and that's Gnosticism. And so I want to go back then to our councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon. And as I said, the main point here is that the question of theology always begins, Christian theology anyway, always begins with who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And your answer to that question is going to be determined by how you read the scripture, how you put it together, and your interpretation of the scripture. Just as important, it will come to pass, is where you are. Where you are. Are you in Alexandria, Egypt? Are you in Palestine? Are you in Italy? Are you in Asia Minor or Greece? Where you are will play a role in how you view, at least in the first 4 centuries of the church. Asia Minor has explodes with relational ontology and Trinitarian thought that doesn't seem to quite take hold in the Latin West, although you do have Augustine by the 5th century who's able to say some things in De Trinitate that are just exalting. So the first, we're going to talk about the canon just a little bit, and then we'll talk about Nicaea and Chalcedon, and we will do that in parts. So that concludes this first part where we kind of went through those Apostolic Fathers. You should know those. And we went also through the heresies that set us up for these councils.